It began with a polite smile that fooled no one. Denzel Washington stood backstage at the View, a man known for calm precision in every word he spoke. Yet there was an unmistakable edge in his eyes that told the crew this would be no ordinary sit-down. The last time Denzel shared this stage with Sunny Hostin, it ended in a clash that left audiences stunned and producers scrambling to spin the fallout. Some called it a misunderstanding. Others called it a warning shot. But no one, not the viewers, not Sunny herself, forgot how quickly Denzel's mask of polite civility could drop when he felt disrespected. And now, months later, here he was again. Back in the same New York studio, the same buzzing audience, the same co-hosts shifting in their seats, hoping lightning wouldn't strike twice. But it would. And this time, it would strike harder. Behind the curtain, Denzel adjusted his cufflinks as a young stagehand asked if he needed anything. He shook his head, that famous half-smile flickering just long enough to unnerve the kid before it vanished. Inside the studio, Sunny Hostin leaned forward at the table, her stack of papers arranged like a lawyer's brief. She'd spent the morning telling anyone who would listen that this time, she would not let Denzel bully his way through a conversation. This time, she would hold him accountable. For what exactly? That remained fuzzy. But the word accountability rolled off her tongue with the kind of certainty that only crumbles when tested. Whoopi Goldberg cleared her throat. Already bracing herself for the fireworks, she felt rumbling under the polite laughter of the audience. Joy Behar adjusted her glasses, her eyes flicking between the teleprompter and Sunny, already calculating how much damage control they'd be doing before the next commercial break. The producer's voice crackled through the earpieces. We're live in 5, 4, 3. When Denzel stepped into the lights, the applause was thunderous, warm at first, then splintered by a nervous tension no one could quite name. He waved, flashed that disarming grin that had made him a legend. But when his eyes locked with Sunny's across the table, the grin flickered, and the whole room seemed to exhale as if it knew it had just seen the real man behind the charm. Whoopi's voice carried the weight of a referee forced into a fight she'd rather watch from home. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Please welcome back Denzel Washington." "Denzel, thank you for being here." Denzel nodded, his voice calm but threaded with a steel that everyone recognized from his fiercest movie monologues. Denzel Washington said, "Good to be back. Though I'm not sure you really want me back, but here we are." The audience chuckled, but the chuckle felt like a warning. Sunny leaned in, her tone syrupy with that practiced lawyer's patience. Sunny Hostin said, "Well, Denzel, last time you were here, you made some comments that a lot of people felt were dismissive. You talked about the media, about accountability, but you never took any responsibility for your own influence, your own words. Are you ready to do that today?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. Whoopi shifted in her seat, glancing at the producer who just gave her a helpless shrug. Denzel's eyes never left Sunny's. He clasped his hands on the table, a posture that said he was here to talk, but not here to beg. Denzel Washington said, "See, Sunny, that's the problem right there. You talk about my words like they're the issue, but you never ask yourself why they hit so hard. You don't want the truth. You want a version that makes you comfortable. But I'm not here to make you comfortable." The room stilled. Joy Behar dropped her pen, lips tightening as she realized they were headed straight back to the same powder keg they'd thought they'd buried last time. Sunny bristled, her papers forgotten now as her voice rose just enough to rattle the cups on the table. Sunny Hostin said, "So you don't think you have any responsibility? You sit here, you make these sweeping statements about the press, about politicians, but you don't think your celebrity status gives you a special obligation to be more careful?" Denzel leaned in, and for a heartbeat, he looked every bit the man you don't interrupt in a courtroom or a street corner at midnight. Denzel Washington said, "I think my obligation is to the truth. Not your version of it, not the corporate version of it, the real truth. And if that makes people squirm, that's on them." Sunny opened her mouth to fire back, but the audience was already reacting, half gasping, half clapping, that uncertain rhythm that only happens when people realize they're watching a fight slip out of control. Whoopi tried to step in, her hands raised like a white flag. Whoopi Goldberg said, all right, Let's breathe, folks. Let's take a second. But no one was breathing. Denzel had leaned back, eyes still locked on Sunny, and the look on her face said she was just getting started. Whatever was coming next wouldn't be polite. And no one, not the audience, not the producers, not even Sunny herself, was ready for just how hard he was about to swing back. Sunny Hostin could feel her heartbeat in her ears, louder than the polite studio applause that faded the second she turned back to Denzel. She forced a tight smile that never reached her eyes, her fingers tapping the stack of papers she had stacked like armor. Sunny Hostin said, "You keep saying the truth, Denzel, but you never define it. Whose truth is it really? Because some people say your comments give cover to conspiracy theorists, people who twist your words to push dangerous ideas." Denzel's eyes narrowed just slightly, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for Whoopi to tense beside him. The audience sat motionless, leaning forward as if afraid to breathe too loudly. Denzel Washington said, "And who are those some people, Sunny? You? Your producers? The same people who write headlines that lie every day and call it news? Or is it the folks who like to slice up every sentence I say so they can sell more ads?" His voice was calm, but his jaw tightened on the final words. He glanced out at the audience, rows of eyes reflecting curiosity, unease, maybe even admiration for the way he spoke what they themselves never could on national TV. Sunny leaned forward, her tone turning sharp enough to cut. Sunny Hostin said, "So now you're accusing me of twisting your words? I'm asking you to clarify. You know exactly how much influence you have. You're Denzel Washington. Do you really think your words don't matter? Do you think they're harmless when they get used by people who don't care about facts?" Denzel gave a short, humorless laugh that carried more weight than if he'd shouted. Denzel Washington said, "Sunny, the facts never needed your permission to exist. I can't help it if some people can't handle them. What you call influence is just honesty that makes people like you uncomfortable." Joy Behar broke in, trying to rescue the moment, but her eyes flicked nervously to the floor manager, who was already signaling for the next break. Joy Behar said, Okay, let's take this down a notch. We all know Denzel's a truth teller, but maybe we can talk about your new project, Denzel, the movie, the one about justice, right?" But Sunny wasn't ready to move on. She wasn't ready to give up the fight. She'd prepared for this moment like a lawyer in front of a hostile witness, and she refused to lose control. Sunny Hostin said, "No, I think the audience wants to hear an answer. You sit here and you dismiss the press, you dismiss facts you don't like, and you still get to call yourself honest? What does that say to people who look up to you?" The tension in the room doubled, sharp enough to slice the stage lights in half. A woman in the front row gasped as Denzel leaned in, resting both elbows on the table, that signature calm now edged with a warning. Denzel Washington said, "What it says, Sunny, is that they should look twice at people who tell them what to think. It says they should question you. Question me. Question every headline that tells them who's good and who's bad, without ever letting them see the whole story." He turned slightly, catching Whoopi's eye, as if to signal he wasn't done, not even close. Denzel Washington said, "See, you want to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about your responsibility, all of you, right here. You get to sit at this table every day, telling millions of people what to be afraid of, what to cancel, what to believe, and you do it with a smile. And when someone shows up who doesn't play your game, you call it dangerous." Sunny's face was flushed now, but she forced her voice to steady. She reached for her papers, flipping through them like she could find a question sharp enough to slice through his armor. Sunny Hostin said, "We have a responsibility to the truth. And you don't get to twist that because it makes you feel righteous." Denzel's answer was so quiet that the studio had to lean in to catch every word, a deadly calm that felt more dangerous than any shout. Denzel Washington said, "No, Sunny. You have a responsibility to power, to ratings, to the same sponsors who sell fear every commercial break. But me? I answer to my conscience. And that's what keeps me free." A rumble of applause spread through the audience, hesitant at first, then louder when a young man near the back stood and clapped, his eyes locked on Sunny like he'd just watched her lose a battle she'd sworn she could win. Whoopi raised her hand, her voice firm but calm. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Let's take a breath, all right? We're going to keep this respectful. We're not done yet." Denzel's eyes never left Sunny's, that quiet fury still burning like a storm waiting to hit shore. And Sunny, for all her notes and all her practiced lines, seemed to realize for the first time that the truth she thought she could control was bigger than any cue card. Sunny Hostin's fingers drummed restlessly on her stack of notes, as if the next question would appear by magic. Her usual courtroom confidence faltered in the silence that settled after Denzel's last words, a silence so thick it felt like a challenge all its own. The audience watched them like spectators at the edge of a cliff. Some leaned forward, hungry for the next blow. Others leaned back, half afraid the whole table might snap in two. Whoopi Goldberg cleared her throat, her voice the only thing that kept the air from shattering. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Denzel, you've made your point about honesty. But you've got people out there, real folks who hang on every word you say. Do you ever worry they'll misunderstand what you mean about the media? That they'll tune out everything, even when the truth is being told?" Denzel turned to Whoopi, and for a flicker of a moment his eyes softened, not gentle, but clear, like a father explaining the world to someone he wanted to understand. Denzel Washington said, "I don't want anyone to tune anything out, Whoopi. I want them to listen harder. To everybody. But not just to the loudest voice in the room. Not just the one selling them fear. Listen, read, pay attention, and then make up your own mind." He paused, his eyes flicking back to Sunny, who sat rigid, her pen now tapping the table with nervous energy. Denzel Washington said, "What scares you is that when people do that, really do that, they don't always come back to you for permission to think." A few people in the audience clapped, too soon, too loud, but the tension swallowed it whole. Sunny sat up straighter, her voice low but tight, each word clipped like she was trying not to show the tremor in her resolve. Sunny Hostin said, "What scares me is misinformation. What scares me is people cherry-picking facts to suit their bias. You want people to think for themselves? Fine. But you can't pretend that people with your platform don't fuel the chaos when they toss out half-truths without context." Denzel's head tilted, that small half-smile appearing again. The same smile that told you he'd seen through the game before you even knew you were playing it. Denzel Washington said, "Context? You think you get to decide what context looks like? You, or any of you, can take a clip, cut it to 30 seconds, spin it however you want, slap a headline on it, and by the time I open my mouth to clarify, it's already gospel." He leaned forward, his hands clasped, voice so steady it made his words feel carved in stone. Denzel Washington said, "So let's not pretend this is about context. It's about control. You want control of the story, and when someone won't let you have it, you call it dangerous." Sunny tried to jump in, her eyes darting to the audience for support. Sunny Hostin said, "I'm talking about facts, Denzel." But Denzel cut her off with a single gesture. Calm, unflinching. Denzel Washington said, "You want facts? Here's a fact, Sunny. The media sells fear. Fear gets clicks, clicks get money. So you tell people to be afraid of people like me, a man who says, don't believe everything you hear. That's not dangerous, that's freedom." The audience broke into hesitant applause again, a sound that started with uncertainty and ended with the restless energy of people waking up to a fight they'd seen from the outside for too long. Joy Behar's voice wavered as she tried to pull the room back to neutral ground. Joy Behar said, Maybe we should take a quick break. Let everybody catch their breath." But Sunny wasn't having it. She slammed her pen down so sharply the sound echoed off the stage walls. Sunny Hostin said, No, let's keep this right here. Denzel wants to talk about fear? Fine. Let's talk about the fear people feel when celebrities with no expertise push conspiracy theories about the press, about elections, about the justice system. Denzel's laugh was short and humorless, slicing through her monologue like a blade. Denzel Washington said, Don't you dare. Don't you dare twist my words into something I didn't say. I never told anyone to stop asking questions. I told them to stop swallowing answers that are sold to them like candy." He turned, locking eyes with the audience, that famous, razor-sharp gaze that made even the cheap seats feel like the front row. Denzel Washington said, "And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. Maybe you should feel uncomfortable. Maybe you should question me. And her. And everybody who profits from your fear." Sunny looked like she wanted to respond. Needed to, but for the first time her mouth hung open, words refusing to form as the audience watched, phones lifted, recording every heartbeat of the moment. Whoopi pressed her palms flat on the table, her voice the final thread holding the conversation together. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Let's get back. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, maybe we can find out what Denzel's working on next, and maybe, just maybe, we can figure out if there's any middle ground left." But the way Denzel's eyes stayed locked on Sunny, the audience knew one thing for sure. The next round wasn't going to be any gentler than the first. The commercial break was anything but a break. Audience members leaned forward in their seats, phones buzzing as they whispered about what they'd just seen. The crew hustled behind the cameras, eyes darting between Sunny's tight jaw and Denzel's unsettling calm. Sunny Hostin sat stiffly, her notes now spread out like a barricade she couldn't seem to hide behind. She kept her eyes locked on Denzel, as if she could will him to break first. But Denzel just sat there, hands folded, shoulders relaxed, the only tension alive in that unwavering stare. When the cameras snapped back on, Whoopi forced a smile that didn't fool anyone. Whoopi Goldberg said, "All right, we're back. And, Denzel, before we get into your new project, Sunny, I know you wanted to finish your thought." Sunny forced her smile wide enough to show teeth, but there was no warmth in it. She shuffled her notes as if they held a lifeline. Sunny Hostin said, "Thank you, Whoopi. Look, I want to be clear. Nobody here is saying we shouldn't ask questions. But when someone like you, Denzel, someone who has millions of people listening, undermines trust in the press, in our institutions, you feed something dangerous." She leaned in, her voice pitching louder as if sheer volume might tilt the balance back her way. Sunny Hostin said, "You say you're telling people to think for themselves, but you never admit when you get it wrong. You never own the real harm that comes from people believing misinformation." Denzel tilted his head, a spark of something darker flickering across his face. He gave a small nod, as if giving her all the rope she wanted. Denzel Washington said, "You want to talk about misinformation, Sunny? All right, let's talk about it." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulling out a small folded paper that had the audience craning their necks. He laid it gently on the table, the gesture deliberate, surgical. Denzel Washington said, "Last year, when I was on this very show, you misquoted me on air the next day. You said I told people not to trust anyone. You clipped the part where I said, 'Don't trust anyone without checking the facts yourself.'" The color drained from Sunny's face. Whoopi's eyes widened, and Joy let out a low whistle she didn't bother to hide. Denzel tapped the paper, his tone calm, but sharp enough to cut. Denzel Washington said, "This is the transcript. Full, unedited. Not your soundbite version. Funny how you never corrected that, Sunny. Never told the people who watched this show that you left out the part that matters." The audience rippled with murmurs, the tension now tinged with something like disbelief. Sunny snatched up the paper, scanning it, but the lines were there in black and white. Her lips moved as she read, but no words came out. Whoopi tried to step in, her voice measured. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Sunny, is that true? Did we not run the full quote?" Sunny Hostin stammered, her lawyer's poise crumbling at the edges. Sunny Hostin said, That's not how I remember it. We cited the part that mattered." Denzel leaned back, a low chuckle escaping his lips, not joyful, but pitying. Denzel Washington said, "The part that mattered, huh? The part that sells? That keeps people afraid. You talk about facts, Sunny, but you don't like the ones you can't bend." He turned to the audience, his voice firm but somehow warmer, pulling them into the truth he'd carried here like a shield. Denzel Washington said, "You know what misinformation really is? It's not a slip-up. It's a habit. It's when people with power pick the pieces that fit the story they want and toss the rest in the trash. I'm not perfect, but I won't stand here and let you paint me like I'm the one twisting the truth." Sunny tried to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. Her eyes darted from the transcript in her hands to the cameras now locked on her every blink, every breath. Joy Behar let out a low breath, her attempt at humor falling flat. Joy Behar said, "Well, looks like we've got all the receipts today." The audience laughed, not cruelly, but knowingly. The laughter you hear when someone tries to bluff with a losing hand, and the whole room sees their cards. Whoopi raised her palms again, her voice quiet but firm. Whoopi Goldberg said, "All right, let's take a step back. Denzel, final thoughts on this before we move on." Denzel didn't even glance at Sunny this time. He spoke directly to the people watching at home, his voice steady as stone. Denzel Washington said, "Don't take my word for it. Don't take hers. Don't take anybody's. Check for yourself. Think for yourself. And never forget who profits when you're too scared to do that." The studio fell into a hush, the hum of cameras the only sound as the truth of his words settled over every seat. And Sunny Hostin, once so sure she could pin him down with clever lines, sat frozen, a lawyer without an argument. The studio lights seemed brighter now, every shadow wiped away under the glare of cameras that captured every twitch of Sunny's strained smile. The air crackled with the sound of the audience's shifting chairs, that restless energy when everyone knows they've witnessed something bigger than a celebrity spat. Whoopi Goldberg leaned in, her tone careful, as if choosing every word like a stepping stone across a minefield. Whoopi Goldberg said, "Denzel, before we wrap, you brought up something important. You said it's not about taking your word or ours. It's about people doing the work themselves. So what's your message to those folks sitting at home, watching this?" Denzel exhaled slowly, the only sign of the storm that had just thundered across the table. He looked around the studio, eyes landing on the rows of faces now locked onto him with the kind of attention no publicist could ever buy. Denzel Washington said, "My message is simple. You got a brain, use it. Don't rent it out to people who cash checks off your fear. When I say don't trust the press blindly, I mean don't trust me blindly either. Look things up. Ask why they say what they say. Ask who benefits when you're angry or scared." He paused, the silence carrying the weight of a church bell in a funeral hall. Denzel Washington said, "And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. Growth comes from uncomfortable places. But don't ever hand over your mind to someone else and think they'll protect it for you." Sunny Hostin forced out a brittle laugh that sounded like glass cracking underfoot. She straightened her papers again, a futile ritual now, her fortress reduced to scraps. Sunny Hostin said, "That's a nice speech, Denzel. But some people don't have the luxury to sift through conspiracy theories all day. They rely on trusted voices. And when trusted voices say things that get twisted." Denzel cut her off with a raised hand. "Not rude, just final." Denzel Washington said, "And when trusted voices decide what parts of the truth you deserve, that's when you stop trusting and start verifying. Period." The audience erupted, not just clapping politely but pounding palms against the armrests, the sound echoing off the studio walls like a courtroom verdict. Someone shouted, "Tell him, Denzel," and laughter rippled through the room. The warm kind, the kind that says he said what we wish we could say. Joy Behar, her tone lighter now, but her eyes sharp as ever, leaned forward. Joy Behar said, "So, Denzel, you're going to come back again, right? Or are we officially too hot to handle for you?" Denzel let out a real laugh then. That unmistakable, low rumble that made half the audience grin just to hear it. Denzel Washington said, "Joy, you know me. I'll come back anytime you want the truth to make the room a little uncomfortable." He stood, microphone still clipped to his jacket, and turned to the audience. The cameras followed as people rose to their feet, a rare standing ovation that wasn't for an actor in a role, but for a man refusing to play the part they'd written for him. Sunny Hostin didn't stand. She sat frozen, her eyes on her silent stack of notes. All the lines that hadn't landed, all the spin that had unraveled with a single folded piece of paper. Whoopi reached out, her hand on Sunny's shoulder, a gesture that said, "We're live. Hold your head up," but everyone could see the truth. Some moments can't be spun. Some receipts don't get lost in the edit bay. As Denzel strode off the set, He paused just long enough to glance back at Sunny, not with malice, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd reminded millions that no question is too dangerous when you're strong enough to ask it for yourself. The cameras rolled on Joy and Whoopi trying to regain the banter, but the audience didn't hear them. They were already buzzing, sharing clips on phones, texting family, telling friends. You should have seen it. Denzel didn't just show up. He shut it down. In living rooms and break rooms across America, the moment replayed on tiny screens. And no matter what spin tomorrow's headlines tried to sell, everyone knew what they'd seen with their own eyes. When Denzel returned to the view, the truth walked in with him. And no one, not even Sunny Hostin, could stop it from taking a seat at the table.